I used to think resilience was my strength. People said I was tough as nails, that I could carry the weight of the world on my back and still keep my lipstick from smudging. But that strength, my so-called superpower, was a lie I wrapped around myself like a badge, a mask, a noose. And the moment it all unraveled wasn't some dramatic crescendo with fireworks and tears. No. It was a Tuesday. Just after noon. I was halfway through revising a pitch deck for a client I didn't even like when my body gave up. It didn't whisper or beg. It screamed. My knees buckled like a puppet's strings had been cut. My vision tunneled. The fluorescent lights in the office turned into a kaleidoscope of piercing white noise. And I crumpled to the floor of that conference room like an afterthought someone had accidentally brushed off the table. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, and four in my arm, the white walls around me humming with the indifferent sterility of modern medicine. A nurse with kind eyes and the posture of someone who'd seen too much gave me the rundown. I had collapsed from severe exhaustion. Dehydration. Sleep deprivation. Full-body burnout. My vitals had tanked, and my body had gone into shutdown mode. The diagnosis was clinical, almost laughably underwhelming compared to the quiet devastation I felt settling into my bones. No visitors were allowed, not that anyone tried. My phone had been placed neatly on the side table next to a half-empty bottle of water and a folded hospital brochure about managing work-life balance. When I powered it on, there was one message waiting for me. Just one. From Mark, my brother. The one who crashed my car 2 years ago and needed help with the deductible. The same brother I covered for during his DUI hearing so he wouldn't lose his job. His message, a masterclass in gall, read, "Hey, can you still cover my car payment this month?" Not a word about the hospital. Not even a "heard you passed out, were you okay?" Just another request, another withdrawal from an emotional bank account that had long been overdrawn. I stared at the screen for a long time, the glowing letters burning into my retinas like a second-degree betrayal. I lay in that hospital bed with the air conditioning rattling softly above me, drowning in silence. Real silence. Not the kind that comes when people leave the room, but the kind that settles in when you realize they were never really there to begin with. I thought about the times I had picked up the pieces for this family like it was my unpaid job. I remembered spoon-feeding our father when he came home from his triple bypass surgery, waking up every 2 hours to check his vitals because the nurses said it would just be good to have an extra pair of eyes. I remembered how I spent my weekends helping Katie, my sister, who'd once told her therapist that I was the responsible one, navigate a custody battle so bitter it left her too drained to show up for work, but never too drained to ask me for cash. I was everyone's lifeline. Their contingency plan. Their emergency contact. I filled out forms, paid bills, showed up at court dates, babysat during meltdowns, smiled through Thanksgiving even when I hadn't slept in 3 days. And now, lying in a sterile room with nothing but a saline drip and a window overlooking a parking lot, it hit me, I didn't have a lifeline. I didn't have anyone. No one had ever asked, "Lauren, are you okay?" Not really. Not when it mattered. Not without expecting something in return. And in that moment, something inside me ruptured, not loudly, not with fanfare, but like a fault line shifting deep beneath the surface. I realized I wasn't a pillar. I was a crutch they had worn down until I splintered. If I had died in that hospital bed, the only sound to mark my passing would have been the soft, indifferent ping of a missed payment reminder. That thought, journaled in a shaky hand between saline flushes and the shrill beep of the heart monitor, came to define everything I had allowed my life to become. I wasn't a daughter, a sister, or even a person anymore. I was a transaction, just another line item in their spreadsheet of needs, expectations, and last-minute emergencies. And I was done being invoiced for their survival. The morning after the collapse, I stared at the tiny screen of my phone until the dim light of dawn spilled through the Venetian blinds and sliced the shadows across the linoleum floor. The only messages I had received were appointment reminders, a promotional email from my side gig software subscription, and that single masterpiece of self-interest from Mark about his car payment. No missed calls. No voicemails. No panicked texts asking what happened or how I was feeling. Just the echoing silence of people who only noticed my absence when it cost them something, with my thumb trembling, not from emotion, but from the 4 still taped clumsily to the back of my hand. I opened the family group chat. Fam, it read. A cruel joke, really. Thread after thread of birthday photos I had taken, graduation gifts I had financed, last-minute babysitting favors I had agreed to. And now, like some bitter monument to imbalance, not a single mention of my hospitalization. I stared at that chat as if it could blink back at me, apologize, beg for another chance. But it didn't. It just sat there, hollow and waiting, like they always did, for me to show up and patch the silence with effort they'd never return. So I pressed down. Long enough for the menu to pop up. And then, with a breath that felt like breaking water after drowning, I hit delete. Not archived. Not muted. Deleted. It wasn't enough. I pulled up my banking app, the one I used to transfer money to Mark on the 15th of every month. Automatic, predictable, loyal, like me. I canceled the recurring payment. Then I checked Katie's Venmo, the one I used to cover half her legal fees every time her ex decided to play dirty. Removed her from my contacts. Finally, I logged into the emergency contact section of my health records. I deleted my father's number and replaced it with the only person who had brought me a glass of water in the past 48 hours, a nurse named Terry, who had held my hand when the 4 burned like fire and whispered, "Honey, it's okay to say no." Then came the hard part. The will.it wasn't complicated, no sprawling estate or legacy trust. Just a modest life insurance policy, a small apartment, and a stack of retirement savings I'd been building like a squirrel burying acorns for a winter that never seemed to end. I had always listed them, Mark, Katie, and even Dad, as beneficiaries. Because despite everything, some part of me had clung to the fantasy that they'd at least grieve with gratitude. But now, after staring death in the eye and finding it no colder than my own bloodline, I changed every name on that document. To whom, you ask? No one. I listed my assets for donation. Every dollar, every item, every last stitch of effort I'd accumulated would go to shelters, women's health organizations, and scholarships for girls who didn't have anyone. Because maybe, just maybe, one of them would read my name someday and think, someone cared. Even if my own family never did, discharge day arrived with a rainstorm so heavy it sounded like God was power washing the sins off the city. I didn't wait for anyone to pick me up. I called a cab, held my hospital bag like it was a life raft, and gave the driver an address I had never spoken aloud until that moment, a small cliffside and 2 hours away, perched on the northern coast where the ocean never stopped roaring and the sky never stopped weeping. The room was modest, with creaky floorboards and salt-stained windows, but it had what I needed most, silence that didn't demand anything from me. No one knocking. No phones ringing. Just the sea and the wind and the breath I hadn't realized I was still capable of taking. The first morning I woke up there, I sat on the porch wrapped in a wool blanket, cradling a cup of bitter coffee and staring at the horizon like it owed me an apology. Guilt crept in, not as a scream, but as a whisper, subtle and slow, curling its fingers around my spine. I remembered my mother's lullabies, sung softly in the yellow glow of a nightlight that flickered like hope. I remembered Dad teaching me to ride a bike on the cracked pavement of our cul-de-sac, holding onto the seat longer than necessary just to make me feel safe. Were those lies too? Or were they just distant truths, eroded by time and dependency? I didn't know. But I knew this: nostalgia is not a reason to drown. So I wrote. For the first time in years, I poured every thought onto the page like blood from an open vein. I wrote about the time Katie borrowed my rent money and promised to pay it back next week. About the day Mark used my credit card to pay for his Cancun getaway because I needed a break, you know how it is. I wrote about Christmases where I cooked for 10 and was handed a scented candle as thanks. About birthdays that passed like shadows. About funerals where I drove, paid for flowers, and somehow still ended up comforting everyone else. Then I wrote one final line in my journal, the line that started it all, that held the weight of my fury and my clarity in equal measure. If I died in that hospital bed, the only sound would be a ping from a missed payment reminder. I read it aloud. Once. Twice. Then I closed the book and sat still long enough for the grief to settle and transform into resolve. They would never understand this choice. They would call me cruel, ungrateful, dramatic. But I wasn't deleting them out of spite. I was erasing them because they had already erased me. And for the first time in my life, I was waking up and choosing something radical, something dangerous, something revolutionary. It had been 72 hours since I last responded to anyone in my family, though calling them my family felt increasingly disingenuous. In that time I had heard nothing but crashing waves, wind through pines, and the peaceful whisper of my own breath. No calls answered. No texts read. Just a silence so profound it felt like a second skin, insulating me from everything I had once mistaken for love. Until the phone vibrated twice before I recognized the number. It was my father's, an old contact I hadn't deleted but hadn't spoken to in months. I let it ring. I always did. The silence mattered more than curiosity. But this time, something in my gut twisted like a rope pulled taut, and when the message icon blinked at me like a dying heartbeat, I listened. Lauren, please. Just call me. What's going on? I talked to Katie, she said you're not answering. I know something's wrong. Please, kiddo. Call me. Even if it's just to say you're okay. His voice was worn down by desperation, not tenderness. It cracked at the edges, not from grief, but from the raw confusion of a man who had never had to ask twice for anything. For a long moment, I sat on the edge of the bed with the phone still in my hand, weighing the sincerity behind his words like a miser appraising counterfeit bills. Was it real worry, or was it panic because his crutch was gone? The answer came the next morning in the form of a voicemail from Mark. His tone lacked any hint of concern or softness. It was all edge, all heat, all transactional rage. Lauren, what the hell? I got a notice from the repo guy. The car is gone. Gone. What the hell am I supposed to do now? You couldn't even give me a heads up? You know I needed that to get to work. You just bail and leave me hanging? This is so typical. Typical. That word slammed into my chest harder than any hospital monitor alarm ever could. Because yes, this was typical. This was the unvarnished truth of what I meant to them. Utility. Reliability. Predictability. I wasn't a person. I was a gear in the engine of their survival, and now that I had removed myself, the whole machine was sputtering. By midday, another message blinked onto my phone. This time it was Katie, her voice cracking with that special blend of panic and entitlement I knew far too well. Lauren, I don't know what's going on, but you need to call me. I've got a court date in 2 days and no one to watch the kids. I tried calling Mom, but she's got her own stuff going on. This isn't like you. Seriously, I need you. Just tell me when you'll be back, okay? I didn't respond. I sat there, listening to the waves again, letting the guilt rise and crash and dissolve like salt in water. Because guilt is just grief in disguise, grief for the fantasy of who they could have been, had they ever chosen to be more. The next day, my father called again. This time he didn't leave a voicemail, but he sent a text. Just 3 words, please come home. It wasn't we miss you. It wasn't are you okay? It wasn't even I love you. Just a request to resume service, like I was a phone line temporarily disconnected. As if my presence could be rebooted like a router and everything would flow smoothly again. But behind those 3 words, I knew the real story. Because what none of them had anticipated was how deeply embedded I had been in their day-to-day function. Without me, there were no last-minute childcare rescues. No emergency bank transfers. No calling the pharmacy to fix their prescriptions. No reminder texts. No bridging conversations between the fighting parties. I had always been the one who made the broken pieces fit just well enough that no one questioned why they were so cracked in the first place, and now, Katie was calling our old babysitter, who had since moved out of state. Mark was scrambling to borrow his girlfriend's rusted-out Corolla. Dad was trying to figure out how to get the family's medical insurance sorted, because I had always been the one who knew the policy numbers by heart. The cracks weren't just showing, they were splintering, but none of it, not a single voicemail, call, or message, had asked about me. My health. My collapse. My body failing in a conference room like a dying machine. Not one of them had said, "I'm sorry." Not one had said, "I didn't know it was this bad." Not one had asked, "What do you need?" They didn't miss me, they missed the services I provided. So finally, after nearly a week of silence, I sent a message. Not to all of them, just to the group chat I had resurrected briefly for this moment, only to kill it again right after. I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting myself. You didn't lose me. You never showed up to keep me. Then I muted every single number. Back at the coast, I sat in the thick hush of evening with a pen in my hand and a journal in my lap, and for the first time in decades, I wrote a list, not of tasks, not of obligations, but of desires. I wanted to go a week without explaining myself. I wanted to sleep without dreaming of inboxes and crying babies. I wanted to laugh without wondering if I was being selfish. I wanted to walk into a room and not be the only adult, and above all else, I wanted to be alone and not feel guilty about it, because if peace is something you have to bleed for, then let the blood run clean. But I wasn't done yet. Oh no, not by a long shot. I had just finished my coffee, dark and bitter as clarity, when the knock came, not frantic or desperate, but deliberate. 3 taps, evenly spaced. Not enough to startle, but enough to say, "This isn't going away quietly." I opened the cabin door slowly, the old hinges groaning like they knew what was coming. There, standing with wind-tousled hair and a trench coat soaked with ocean spray, was my father. He looked smaller than I remembered, older, wearier, like the scaffolding that held him up all those years had started to crack. "Lauren," he said, voice catching like gravel in his throat. I didn't know where else to go. I didn't move. I didn't invite him in. I let the silence sit there, sharp and unmoving, like a wall he had to climb with nothing but his words. "I drove here straight from the house," he continued. "Your aunt gave me the address after I told her I was worried sick. We've all been worried, Lauren." I laughed once, not bitterly, not cruelly, just with the dry awareness of someone who had seen too many reruns of the same play. "You've all been worried?" I asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks more like everyone's been inconvenienced." He took a step forward, but I held up a hand. "Don't," I said, my voice low and steady. "Don't come closer. Just say what you came to say." He paused, then sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping under a weight that had always been mine to carry. "You were always the strong one, the reliable one. I thought you could handle it." I tilted my head, studying him like a stranger, like a man who had been absent even when he was present. "You raised me to clean up your messes," I said, the words sliding out like a blade honed to surgical precision. "Now I'm learning to walk around them." His face tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might shout, might resort to the volume that once passed for authority. But instead, he whispered, "Is there nothing I can say to fix this?" I took a deep breath, letting the cold wind fill the cracks in my resolve. "This isn't about fixing it," I said. "This is about finally acknowledging it was broken." He didn't respond. Just turned slowly and walked back to his car, leaving footprints that the sea would erase in an hour. 2 days later, my phone lit up again, this time, with Mark's name flashing like a siren I'd long learned to ignore. But I answered anyway. "Curiosity is a stubborn ghost, Lauren. This is low. Even for you." No hello. No pause. Just fury wrapped in blame. "You knew I was on the edge with work, and you still cut me off? You want to talk about abandonment? That's what this is. You've abandoned your family." I let the venom pour out of him without interrupting. Let him spit every unearned accusation like it was gospel. And then, when he finally stopped for breath, I answered him. "No," I said. "What I did wasn't abandonment. What I did was stop betraying myself to rescue people who wouldn't throw me a rope." There was silence on the other end, but I didn't wait for a reply. I hung up, blocked the number, and deleted the call history like a confession burned in a fireplace. And just when I thought the storm had passed, Katie showed up. I recognized her car before I saw her face. It pulled up quietly, too quietly, and parked at the edge of the gravel path leading to the cabin. She stepped out slowly, her posture hesitant, almost childlike. And then I saw him, her son, clinging to her side, wide-eyed and curious. I met them halfway, my boots crunching against the gravel, heart a thunderstorm of suspicion and old wounds. "Hi," she said, her voice a fragile bridge between us. I said nothing. Just waited. She crouched down and whispered something to her son, who nodded and walked toward the porch swing with a snack in hand. Then she looked up at me, eyes already brimming. "I didn't come to ask for anything," she said. I needed to say something." I folded my arms, waiting. "I wasn't here to make it easy. I used to think you liked being in control. That you thrived on being the one who fixed everything. But I see it now," she said, her voice cracking. "You weren't in control. You were drowning. And we watched. We let you." A single tear slid down her cheek. Not a performance. Not manipulation. Just the raw unraveling of someone who finally, painfully, saw. "You were the only one holding us together," she whispered, "and I didn't even see you breaking." I looked past her, to the little boy on the swing, who was humming a song I didn't recognize. And for the first time in a long time, I let my arms fall to my sides. "I didn't need to be thanked," I said quietly. "I just needed someone to notice." Katie nodded, silent now, and for a moment, we stood in the kind of stillness that feels like a truce, not peace, not yet, but the beginning of something less broken. 1 year later, I live in a city where no one knows the version of me who collapsed under the weight of obligation and silence. Here, in this new place with its crooked skyline and relentless rain, I walk to work past cafes that don't know my name and grocery stores that don't expect me to remember anyone's dietary restrictions. It's not lonely. It's freedom dressed in anonymity. I took a job at a nonprofit that advocates for mental health access, something I wouldn't have even applied for a year ago because it paid less than what my previous corporate title was worth on paper. But now, I measure my worth in hours slept, in laughter shared, in silence that heals rather than suffocates. Every Thursday evening, I sit in a circle of foldable chairs under the soft glow of string lights in a community center basement. I started this support group 6 months ago after realizing how many women carried families on their backs while pretending the weight was air. We're not therapists, we're survivors. We're the eldest daughters, the fixers, the forgotten glue. And when one of us speaks, the rest do not interrupt. They nod. They understand. It is the safest room I've ever known. My therapist, a sharp and soft woman named Dr. Mehta, once told me that trauma doesn't always show up in flashbacks or nightmares. Sometimes, it's in the impulse to say yes when your soul is screaming no. She said healing is learning to let the silence speak before you fill it with sacrifice. I have our sessions bookmarked in my week like sacred appointments with myself. I never cancel. The last time my father called, he didn't ask for anything. He told me about his new habit of morning walks and how he was trying to learn how to cook something other than microwavable regret. The calls are short, sparse, and, most importantly, respectful. We don't talk about the past. We don't pretend it didn't happen. We just leave it there, like an old shed on land we've chosen not to rebuild. Katie texts now and then. Sometimes she sends photos of her son drawing messy rockets or wearing a superhero cape at the park. Occasionally, she asks how I'm doing, and I believe her when she does. We're not close, but we're honest. And in the rubble of what we were, that honesty feels like a bridge we can choose to cross, one small step at a time. Mark never called again, and I never waited for him to. There's a sort of peace in the absence of certain voices. Like finally muting a fire alarm that was only ever triggered by your existence. I don't resent him. I don't wish him harm. I just wish him elsewhere, forever. This evening, I walked down to the shoreline, where the tide meets the sand like an old friend who no longer demands explanations. The sky was painted in strokes of molten gold and lavender, the kind of light that doesn't ask for attention but commands it anyway. I took off my shoes, letting the cold surf kiss my ankles, and I tucked my phone away in the deep pocket of my coat. No messages needed answering. No emergencies waited for a response. No one expected anything from me except the woman I have slowly, painfully, deliberately becomed. I stood there as the sun began its slow descent behind the edge of the world, and for the first time in longer than I can measure, I smiled, not for anyone else, not as a reflex or a mask, but for myself, because I was still standing, because I chose me, and because that was enough.